Last night's episode of Euphoria, Nate and Cassie's wedding, is, in my opinion, some of the worst writing we've seen on the show ever, and definitive proof that the show has fully jumped the shark because the chaos and the drama is no longer serving the characters or the plot at all. It is seemingly being manufactured at random in order to justify a narrative that no longer makes sense. Now, I don't know if this is like a controversial opinion, but I think that Euphoria has always been camp. I feel like, there's been, especially in season one, there was a lot of response to the show where people said that it felt actually quite realistic and it mirrored their own high school experiences. But then there were also criticisms that the inappropriate subject matter of the show would have been better suited to like college kids. But I think that that is entirely the point. I think that the realism on display is taking advantage in a similar way to a lot of, in my opinion, better shows like Skins have done by utilizing like the heightened emotional range of teenagers to tell relatable stories in the most dramatic way possible. And broadly speaking, I think the first two seasons of the show handled this element fairly well. There are obviously some exceptions. I think Kat's characterization, especially the difference between season one and season two, is a great example of the contradictions and limitations in Sam Levinson's writing. He is the only writer of the show. He famously does not use a writer's room. And I think that there are several drawbacks to that. And that, to me, is the difference. Because while there's always been an undercurrent of violence in the show, it's very mundane. Rue being a junkie, like a low-level junkie that is mixed up with unsavory types, the kind of casual domestic violence that is under the surface in so many situations. These are circumstances that are painfully normal. Like the terror is in how common these horrifying experiences are, and the personal and the conflict is largely emotional and interpersonal. It doesn't seem like Sam Levinson is super interested in that anymore. It feels like he's kind of desperate to position himself as like a contemporary of Tarantino or the Coen brothers with this kind of like irreverent, dismissive, casual violence that is meant for shock value in this season and doesn't really feel like a sensical conclusion of any of these characters' stories. And I think it's really telling that in the making of featurette at the end of this episode, Sam Levinson literally says that this season is all about showing these characters that actions have consequences and essentially punishing them for their wrongdoings, which there are characters that a lot of people want to see punished, like Nate is a good example. But there are other characters whose crimes are far less egregious, whose punishment seems unbalanced, and that's an issue for me a little bit. Before I get into that, I want to talk about like the general inconsistencies of character and story in this season, because I understand that like the season had to be reworked after the tragic, untimely passing of Angus MacLeod. Like that's absolutely horrible. And I know like Sam Levinson has said that the original season 3 was largely going to center around Fez. And so like it's terrible for so many reasons. And then having to start the story from scratch, like I understand, but I also think that like they should have kept trying because nothing makes sense to me here. I think Nate and Cassie getting married in general makes no fucking sense. Maybe from Cassie's perspective, absolutely not from Nate's. It is crazy to me to position Nate as like the entire crux of his character being that he's a star athlete, high academic achiever, beloved, popular student that has this like inner dark, violent nature that he's hiding. And then that character, like even a huge point of conflict between him and Maddie and his mom and Maddie was the difference in their socioeconomic backgrounds and racial backgrounds. And Nate doesn't even go to college. What? Why doesn't Nate go to college? And now creating this like economic problem with his family just to create drama. Again, it feels like taking the most obvious route, creating a problem that wasn't there in the past because what, you can't further extrapolate on where this character naturally would go? And again, this is because none of these people, realistically speaking, are staying in touch after high school. Absolutely no chance. None of these people. And that's why the story is like bending over backwards with the most convoluted storyline possible, changing elements that have been in place for the previous 2 seasons just so that they can justify a story that keeps these characters like in contact with each other. And I think that is bad. And I feel like it's such an unbelievable path for the story to take that it prevents me from actually feeling any like vindication or satisfaction in Nate finally getting his comeuppance and getting some kind of like retribution for being a piece of shit. Because first of all, it has absolutely nothing to do with like his own flaws. It's like a completely separate issue that is just introduced this season, a character flaw that is brand new to this character, despite him having many, many character flaws in the previous seasons that are unrelated to this. But it's the consequences for the other characters being so disproportionate that isn't sitting right with me, because frankly, nothing that any of these female characters have done is remotely on par with anything Nate Jacobs has done. Like, even a little bit. And I know people hate Cassie, not just for her actions last season, but also because like it's impossible to separate Cassie from Sydney Sweeney at this point. And obviously people justifiably have opinions about her. But look, I know I'm going to get shit for this, but like I know people have a hard time separating Sydney from Cassie. I'm talking about just Cassie here. I'm a Cassie defender. I mean, I was last season. I think the writing this season is like completely off the wall, but I still think that the mistake that she made was bad and wrong and selfish and hurtful and like objectively not good by any metric. But I also think that it's a relatively normal like mistake for a teenage girl to make, especially one like with the kind of trauma that she has. I think that people make selfish bad decisions about like when they, you know, feel like they could be picked, when they feel like they could be chosen. Obviously women disproportionately do because of the way patriarchy conditions women to believe that like being chosen by a man is like the highest possible honor you could ever achieve. I think it's bad. I think it's a mistake that a lot of young women make in one form or another, maybe not as egregious as Cassie in this specific situation, but I think it's a thing that, you know, in and of itself is not enough to condemn a woman. And I feel like the punishment that the show and the audience wants Cassie to suffer, the humiliation specifically that the show seems interested in positioning, projecting onto Cassie, is like disproportionate to her crimes. I also think that this like small town crime ring, like unexpected hijinks kind of plot that's being forced in here with Nate and Cassie being newlyweds that are all of a sudden like beholden to the mob is so out of place in this show. Like it feels like the dramatic conclusion of Cassie's story in last season being that she was publicly humiliated on stage in front of all of her friends made sense. That made sense as the logical conclusion for that to be where that storyline went. It was humiliating and awful and dramatic as hell. And it was a natural conclusion to their actions. This plot line feels like it's plucked out of fucking nowhere and has nothing to do with their previous mistakes or anything at all. I also have to mention the depiction of Jules in the show, because in my last video, I talked about the representation of sex work in the show and Sam Levinson's appeared perspective on it. And this episode, we saw a little bit more of that with Jules' sugar baby career. And I don't think that that's like necessarily an unrealistic life path for Jules to take at this stage. But I do think that the way that it was presented felt very fetishy, and like specifically the scene where she's wrapped in saran wrap and her arms are suspended above her head as though she's like hanging from a meat hook felt very much like those photo shoots of models like being made to look like sexy dead girls. And I feel like that is, I felt like it was communicating the message that like sex work is violent, and the women that participate in it like participate in the romanticization of the harm that's being done unto themselves. That was my read of that. But this is where I'm at with this show. I just think that it continues to take the path of least interest every single time. The wedding itself felt like a collection of like the most cringy viral moments you could possibly imagine happening at a wedding that are just so fucking on the nose. The most interesting thing that happened in the entire episode, in my opinion, is Maddie's emotional reaction to the actual wedding. And like Maddie having to deal with all of that, including Nate's fucking bitch mom twisting the knife one final time. That's actually something interesting. But the show continues to avoid these emotional moments for cringe comedy, which I just think sucks. I do think that this is probably my least favorite episode of Euphoria that's ever come out. But it did look really fucking good. The lighting and the cinematography was really great. So that's something.